Let's do a brief intro to royalties, talking about the typical royalties that might be in a lease and previewing some of the problems that we'll deal with in the coming classes, some of the litigation that surrounds royalties. So just as a reminder, here are some of the common types of oil and gas interests. Obviously, you have the fee interest where you own from heaven to hell, you own the minerals along with the surface and everything else. That includes ownership of the minerals. You can sell those minerals. So you can just have a mineral interest. Someone owns the surface, somebody has sold their minerals to others, and that comes with an executive right, which is the right to determine how the minerals are produced. We'll talk about those in future classes. There's that leasehold interest, which is the interest that's transferred from the mineral owner to the oil and gas company that's going to be developing the property. There's a surface interest. You just have the surface, you don't own the minerals. And what we'll be talking about today, that royalty interest. So what is a royalty interest? Well, it's just a share of production or of the money from production. So it could be 10 barrels of oil, or it could be $400 from selling 10 barrels of oil. And that royalty interest doesn't include a right to work the property. You just have a right to money or oil, a share of that production. Doesn't include a right to lease. Often the person getting the royalty is the lessor that's already leased their property. They can't do that anymore. They have leased it to somebody and now they just get a share of the oil and gas. Doesn't include a right to other lease benefits. So we'll see that sometimes somebody with a royalty interest, somebody who's no longer on the property, they're unrelated to the lessor, and they're just getting a share of production. They don't get the other lease benefits like the bonus, the lay rentals, shut-in royalties that only go to the lessor. Okay, most common royalty that we'll deal with is the one from the lessor, the one that the lessor receives, and stereotypically, that was just 1/8 of production. Nowadays, often would be a larger share of production. Kind of royalty interest. As I said, the one we think about most often is the lessor, the landowner's royalty. That's reserved from the lease. That's why the lessor grants the lease to the oil and gas company, the exclusive right to produce on that land and to keep most of the oil and gas. In return, that lessor gets a 1/8 or larger share of the production that happens on the land. They don't have to pay any costs. They just get that share of oil or money from oil and gas. There are other kinds of royalties. One is an overriding royalty. That's granted or reserved from the lease by the lessee, in other words, the oil company. So that oil company says, you know what, I get to keep 7/8 of all production. I'm going to grant 1/16 to somebody who's going to come in and do the drilling for me. Or they could grant it to anybody else. So often it's granted from that leasehold share that the oil and gas company has. A non-participating royalty interest means it's non-participating in any lease. It's separate from any lease. So that's created by a mineral owner to burden the mineral interest. So let's say you have oil and gas on your land and you want to get some money from it. You're not ready to lease it. You don't have an oil and gas company lined up, but you just tell some other person, look, you'll get 1/20th of all the oil and gas that's eventually produced from my land. You've given that other person a non-participating royalty interest in your land. So they're going to be able to keep some of the production whenever it happens, and we'll see that can create lots of legal problems potentially, but it's a good way to get some quick money for the oil and gas on your land before you've even given it to an oil and gas company to develop. So royalties, share of production value, no cost of production. So as a royalty owner, typically you don't care what it costs to produce. You just want the more production, the better, because that means your 1/8 share or 1/3 share or 1/4 share will be a bigger amount of oil, a bigger amount of money. It limits the lessee's risk as well, the oil and gas company, because if they don't find any oil, they don't owe you anything. They already paid you a bonus. They might have paid you some delay rentals, but they're not going to owe you a lot as they would if they had just purchased the mineral interest outright. For the lessor, the landowner, it gives the lessor a stake in production. So they love to see more production. When you might think as a landowner, you don't want this oil and gas company coming on your land. If you have a royalty, you absolutely do want them coming. You say, come on, I want you on as quickly as possible, producing oil and gas so I get a bigger share. Usually, it's the lessor's main compensation under a lease. You might get a decent sized bonus, maybe you even get a big bonus. But if you want to get rich from the oil and gas on your land, that's going to be because of the royalties, that share of continued production. Because if the well hits and there's a lot of oil and gas, your 1A share can add up to a ton of money. All right, you still do get money from these other sources like bonus, rentals, shut-in payments, etc. But the bulk of your money under a successful oil and gas well is going to come from that landowner's royalty, that share. So what does a royalty look like? Here's an example of a Texas oil royalty clause. The royalties to be paid by lessee, oil and gas company, are as follows. On oil, 1/8 of that produced and saved from said land, the same to be delivered at the wells or to the credit of the lessor into the pipeline to which the wells may be connected. All right, so what is this? Is this money or oil? This is actually just oil. So give me actually 1/8 of all the oil that's produced from this well. Sometimes you'll see added to this, or in the absence of a pipeline connection to the transporter receiving lessee's oil at the same price received by lessee. So in other words, sometimes you're going to rely on that oil and gas company to sell the oil for you, and then you're going to want a 1/8 share of that money. You can see also that the typical clause allows for it to be to your credit. So basically, these are the lessor's barrels being delivered to the pipeline, so you're going to have to pay the lessor for them. Okay, a gas royalty clause. Here's one example, and we'll look at a couple of what a gas royalty clause could look like. On gas produced from said land and sold or used off the premises, the market value at the well of 1/8 of the gas so sold or used, provided that on gas sold at the wells, the royalty shall be 1/8 of the amount realized from such sale. Okay, I want you to look carefully at what that's saying. So it's 1/8, right, of the gas production. But in one case, it says if it's sold and used off the premises, then we want 1/8 of market value. On the other hand, if it's sold at the wells, then we want 1/8 of the amount realized, which basically means the amount the oil and gas company was paid. And we'll see that leases often use one term or the other or both. Either they want a share of how much the oil and gas company got or of the market value. So I want you to think about a hypothetical, then we'll look at a real case, but we'll return to this hypothetical in class. So imagine that the lease just said the royalties to be paid on gas by the lessee are 1/8 of the amount realized by lessee computed at the mouth of the well. Okay, so what does this say? Is it the market value or amount realized? Okay, it's the amount realized. Now note that it says computed at the mouth of the well, and we'll talk about what that means in a little while, but it can create some complications. The hypothetical I want you to think about is what happens nowadays when sometimes the oil and gas company has to pay someone to take that natural gas away. We've talked about how there's flaring all over Texas and North Dakota because that gas is worth zero at the well. If there was somebody that was willing to pay for it, they would obviously sell it. They're burning it because it's worth zero or less than zero. And we've seen increasingly, there have been months, weeks, etc., where you had negative natural gas prices. You had to pay somebody to take it away. And because it says at the mouth of the well, that means that in theory, the oil and gas company can say, well, it cost me $1 per MMBTU or per MCF to get that natural gas to the place where I then had to pay somebody another dollar per MCF to take it away from me. So there can be a substantial negative charge for what that gas was worth at the well. So let me ask you, if that's what the lease says, that the lessee is to pay 1/8 of the amount realized on that gas, can that be used against the lessor? So let's imagine a number of ways it could be used. One question is, could it be used to offset if there was oil royalty? So imagine that this is an oil and gas well. There's some, 1/8 of the oil production is valuable, and you would pay that to the lessor, the landowner. But as the oil and gas company, you say, well, wait a second, I'm actually not receiving money for all this gas, I'm paying money. So you know what, I'm gonna net these things out against each other. So normally, I would give you $100 in oil. Right now, I'm paying $20 to get rid of your gas. So instead, I'm just gonna give you $80. I'm gonna net that out. So can the lessor offset that 1/8 of the negative price against the oil royalty? Important question. Think about what you think about that. Okay. Well, what if there's no oil to offset against? Or let's imagine that the gas royalty that had to require an actual payment from the oil and gas company to somebody to take it away is actually bigger than the oil royalty. So imagine that they had to pay $100 to get the gas taken away, and there was only $50 of oil royalty that month. In that situation, could the oil and gas company say, you know what, on that, you owe me $50. And so next month, if I'm supposed to pay you $200 because oil prices and gas prices have recovered a little bit, you still owe me $50. So next month, I'm only giving you $150. So can you carry that loss forward and recover it later? Okay, a third question. What if the oil and gas company says, I don't want to wait till next month to get my money back? You owe me $50 now. If you look at the value of 1/8 of your oil and gas, for this month, it was negative. For this month, it was negative $50. So here's a bill, pay me $50. Can the lessor send the lessee a bill? These are important questions that are currently being considered by oil and gas companies. I can tell you that oil and gas companies are handling this in all different ways, and oil and gas lawyers are worrying about how to handle this situation. From an oil and gas company's perspective, you don't usually send your lessor landowner a bill. You're supposed to be sending them money. So it's a very unusual situation to be saying, here's a charge that I'm charging against you, but that's the reality of negative prices. And I want you to think about in terms of what a lease is supposed to do, and also in terms of the text of a lease, and remember, they'll all be different. What's the right result here? All right, let's talk about a case where we had a clear focus on this sort of market value question. That's the Izagira versus KCS Resources case from the Supreme Court of Texas, 2001. It's on page 334 in your book. So in that case, the oil and gas company was getting $8 an MCF for its gas under a long-term contract. But it was only paying royalty owners their share using the market value, because it had one of those leases that said, if I'm selling gas off the premises, then we'll give you 1/8 of market value. Well, if the market value was $2 an MCF, how is the oil and gas company getting $8 an MCF? It had made a good bet. It basically had signed a long-term gas contract when prices were higher that called for $8 an MCF. And as it turned out, that was a good thing to do because subsequently market rates fell to $2 an MCF. The lease gas royalty says you get the market value of gas sold off the premises. That's very common, and we'll talk about that more, and some of the reasons that might be. But also the lease said amount realized from amount sold at the well, but this was sold off premises, so we go with that first term. market value of gas sold off the premises. And Texas has followed this rule called the Vela rule from this 1968 decision. And it says the landowner gets paid on the current market rate if it's a market value lease, even if the gas is sold at a lower rate under the long-term contract. So the Vela was in the flip situation where the oil and gas company had made a bad long-term contract, and the Supreme Court of Texas said, I'm sorry, oil and gas company, you made a bad long-term contract. You have to pay at the market rate for gas currently, even though that's higher than what you, oil and gas company, are receiving under your long-term contract. Izagira is the opposite. Oil and gas company made a good bet. It's getting a higher price than the current market rate, but the landowner only gets compensated at the market rate. All right. So there is a lot of litigation about market value royalties because of this concern about what's market value when it differs from what the current market value is and the long-term contract price that somebody has locked in, because gas markets fluctuate, and you might want to just say, okay, I promise to pay $8 an MCF for the next 5 years. So the majority rule, which is the rule in Texas, is this Vela rule. Market value seems to say what a willing buyer and seller would agree on at the time of production. So it's that market value whenever it was produced. That's the rule in Texas, Kansas, Montana, North Dakota. The minority rule, the Terra rule, is from a somewhat more recent Oklahoma case, 1981. And that says, well, wait a second, market value doesn't mean instantaneous market value at the moment something was produced. If someone sells gas at a long-term contract at $8 an MCF, that means it's the market value. So in other words, if it was an open market transaction, that for the length of that transaction, if it was 5 years or 10 years, gas was worth $8 an MCF. That's why they locked in that price. And so the theory of Oklahoma is it has to be based on a long-term contract price because the lease is a cooperative venture and the lessee has an implied duty to sell that gas, which may mean agreeing to a long-term contract to reduce the risk of price fluctuation. After all, it's not like the oil and gas company is trying to harm the lessor. The oil and gas company is trying to find somebody who will promise to buy that gas. Because if you just produce gas and nobody's provided to buy it yet, then it's not worth anything, right? Unless you can find somebody to take it away. So the idea is the oil and gas company and the lessor have the same interest in securing a buyer for that gas. And so the long-term contract price is the market value of the royalty. So that's the Oklahoma rule, but in Texas we follow Vela. Market value means market value at the time it was produced. So how do you actually determine what the market value of gas is at the well? Well, the easiest way to do that would be the price at which the gas was actually sold. So if you don't have a long-term contract, and you could say, look, that's what we were selling it for that week because that's what it was worth that week. That's going to be pretty good evidence of what the market value is at the well. But if it's under a long-term contract and you don't have an instantaneous sale or a sale right at that time period, prices fluctuate. So they'll fluctuate. So the long-term price, maybe is evidence of what it was over that whole 10-year period, but it's not evidence of what it was on the day you sold. So you have to use some other sources of evidence as well. One option is to look at comparable sales. Okay, so the gas from this well was sold under a long-term contract, but there's a neighboring well, they were selling week to week, month to month, year to year, and this is what gas sold for there. Now, keep in mind, comparable sales can actually be difficult, and that's for a lot of reasons. I mean, you have to get the time that it was sold right, but also the length of time. Because maybe you're willing to sell at a discount if somebody will agree to purchase for a long period of time. You have to think about the quality of the gas. Just like we had sweet and sour oil, we have sweet and sour gas. Some gas has more impurities. It requires more processing to make it into a saleable product. So quality matters. quantity matters too. So sometimes, party will say, look, if you can get me all the gas I need, then I'm going to pay I'll pay a little bit more for it. But if it's just, I'm not going to go dribs and drabs to get all the gas I need together. And so you might get paid a bonus based on quantity. Of course, market availability is also extremely important. So maybe the neighbor always has somebody willing to purchase from them. If you tried to sell, you wouldn't necessarily receive the same price. So markets can change both in the short term and the long term. Okay, another method is, and this is often necessary because those leases, as we described, often say, what's the market value at the well? Often the natural gas isn't sold at the well. There's nobody showing up at the well saying, hey, give me gas, I'll find somebody to purchase. Sometimes you need to go find that consumer who actually wants to buy the gas. If that's the case and they are far down the road, you need to net back to find what that gas was worth at the well. And the reason is maybe the gas is worth a lot by the time you get it to somebody willing to purchase it, but maybe you also paid a lot to transport it to them. So if you look at what that gas was really worth at the well, it could be substantially less. So here's how that net back works. We have to think about the oil and gas system as flowing from upstream to downstream. So upstream is where drilling takes place. It's where you can think about the oil and gas, or maybe it's easiest to think about oil, sort of flowing downhill, like from upstream, which is where it's drilled, from the wellhead, downstream to the people that use that. And that terminology is used a lot in the oil and gas industry. So you have the producers upstream drilling and the consumers downstream using that oil. So if you drill for oil at the wellhead, then there's a lot of things that have to do before that oil and gas get to market. And if we concentrate on gas, you have to gather it, and so you have to have lines to gather it, transport it. You have to process it. So you might have to strip out that sulfur, water, other things. There could be a lot of different stages. And then you have to transport it a lot until it gets to the end users that need it. And it could be used for power, heat, manufacturing, a lot of things. So if we really wanted to simplify, we could say, well, what if you sold to that end user here for $3 an MMBTU? The units that we use for natural gas are typically MCF, right, which is a measurement of volume, or MMBTU, which is a measurement of energy content. And so let's say that we sold for $3 an MMBTU our gas to this end user. Now imagine that it cost about $1 per MMBTU to take that gas from the well to that end user. So you had to gather it, you had to transport it, you had to process it until it was ready for them to use. Then you would say the net back of this gas is $2 per MMBTU. So that gas was really worth $2 an MMBTU at the well, even though you sold it for $3 an MMBTU over here. Now, what I can tell you is this net back process, I've tried to draw it simply. It can actually be quite complicated. And the reason it can be complicated is there might be disputes about how much each of these steps along the way, gathering and transport, processing, pipeline transport, how much should those have really cost? Because, if you're being charged per MMBTU by the pipeline, et cetera, okay, fine. But what if you invested in the pipeline yourself and you say, I think if I average out my expenses on this processing facility, on this gathering facility, it works out to about $1 an MMBTU. For the lessor, the landowner, all they know is, wait a second, you sold it for $3 an MMBTU. Why am I only getting $2 an MMBTU? You have to provide that accounting, but as we'll see, that can create lots of controversy, lots of lawsuits, etc. All right. Another issue is sometimes there are payments that are made to oil and gas company producers, and it's not really clear if they're a royalty. And that can lead to disputes, which I'll just kind of preview, are described in your book. So, as an example, think about a take-or-pay payment. Now, what a take-or-pay payment is if a buyer, in the past it was often a pipeline, says, I will buy gas from you, from an oil and gas company, whether or not I take gas that month. So as a oil and gas company looking to sell the gas from a well, your big challenge is finding somebody who will promise to take that gas every time it's produced. So a pipeline as an incentive can say, you know what, I'll buy from you no matter what. If I've got no one to sell that to, or if there's no room in the pipeline, you know what, I'll pay you even if I don't take your gas. So it's a take or pay contract. Either I take your gas, I'm paying for it, or I'll just pay you anyway. So it's really kind of a pay or pay. One way or another, you will get paid for the natural gas that you are producing or would like to produce if somebody would take it. So usually the way it works is that if a pipeline pays for the gas without taking it because it couldn't or it didn't have a user for it right away, usually it will have the right to make that up in a subsequent month where they'll say, okay, I paid you for gas, I didn't even take it last month, I want double the gas this month. So that can, because I've already paid for it. So that's something that it can work, but whether that works depends with the oil and gas company as well. Because if they're going to agree to that, they have to be ready to produce, more when the company wants to double up its take that particular month. So what happened is there was a lot of litigation on whether those payments where no gas was taken count as a royalty to be shared with the lessor landowner, because in the 1980s there was a recession and the price of gas went way down. People were using far less gas. So those pipelines, all of a sudden, they didn't have anybody, they didn't want to purchase that gas because they didn't have anyone to sell it to. Nobody would buy it. And so that gas was just sitting there. They didn't want it. And so they said, okay, well, I'm not taking it, so I guess I have to pay. That's how the take or pay contract works. I'd have to pay. The problem is that the pipelines then went bankrupt. The pipelines tried to say, this is force majeure. This is, so in other words, parties weren't thinking about this. This is force majeure in our take or pay agreement. They lost most of those cases. So now all of a sudden, they have to settle those cases. Now, a lot of them are bankrupt or close to bankruptcy, so they typically only paid pennies on the dollar. But basically, they settle those agreements with the oil and gas companies. And now think about what's happened. So the oil and gas companies had these agreements with the pipelines, and the pipelines were supposed to take their gas, but they didn't. So oil and gas companies just left the gas on the ground, flared it, whatever they needed to do operationally, but they didn't give it to the pipelines because pipelines weren't willing to take it. The pipelines owed them money under these take or pay contracts, but that money wasn't payment for gas. It wasn't amount realized under the lease because it wasn't a payment for gas that they actually received. They refused to take that gas. So then the question is, does it need to be shared with the landowners? Do the landowners get 1/8 of all that settlement money that was received by the oil and gas companies? Royalty owners said, yeah, you should have paid that all along for me because those payments, yeah, they didn't take the gas literally, but that was in return for gas purchases. It was just a substitute for a payment on gas. And so that was really part of your effort to receive the most money for the gas, was that you get either payment for the gas or that payment, kind of insurance on that, we should get a portion as well. So what I can tell you is that federally and also in Texas and Oklahoma, the idea was no, royalty is due on produced gas. This is plain term in the lease. You're supposed to get 1/8 of the value of all gas produced. no gas was produced in return for these payments that came from these take-or-pay settlements. So plain term, therefore, nothing to the landowners. That's just for the oil and gas company. The pipeline violated its agreement with the oil and gas company. Payment goes to the oil and gas company. Nothing is shared with the landowner. In Louisiana and Arkansas, however, court said royalty is due on those take-or-pay payments because the lease, again, is a cooperative venture. That was part of, basically, if you look at the lease as a 20-year relationship, the take-or-pay payments were designed to compensate for the value of the gas. And so the payments are just like when they pay for gas that they've taken, and so it has to be shared with the landowner. Okay, this is just a specific example of a wider problem, which is that a lot of times there are compensation that the oil and gas company receives in return for selling gas to someone, and it's not clear, is that really part of the amount realized or the market value of the gas that must be shared with the landowner? So, imagine this. Demand charges. So some contract with a pipeline or other gas buyer would say, if you buy more, you got to pay more. Should that be treated as extra money that the gas received that should be shared with the landowner? What about a signing bonus? What about, you could make an agreement to provide somebody with gas, and the company could say, you know what, and I'll give you $1 million if you sign this agreement. Does that have to be split between all the landowners who are backing up that pledge to provide natural gas? Do they all need to get 1/8 of that signing bonus? What about supply bonus? So these companies commit, I will provide a certain amount of natural gas to you in return for money. Should that money be shared with the landowner? This is a little bit more far-fetched, but a lot of times these are very important commercial relationships, and the oil and gas company that agrees to provide natural gas to the pipeline or to the end user might receive a lot of little perks from the people that they're helping out by providing natural gas. They might say, here's box seats for football game or basketball game, etc. Should the value of that be shared with the landowners? So these are important questions. You can imagine some of these are more closely tied to the gas production than others, but there's certainly open a lot of room for litigation by landowners saying the oil and gas company is getting money for the gas of mine that it's selling that they're not sharing with me. Really, all of these charges should be part of the amount realized, and I want 1/8 of all of it.